Welcome everyone to the Institute of Public Administration special Mastercraft class on caretaker government. And during this election year, this is a very important event, and we're really fortunate today to have Professor Ken Smith joining us. Ken Smith has had terrific experience across Queensland government, being Dean of the Australian New Zealand School of Government, and he's currently Professor of Practice at QUT. And I just did a little calculation that in this election year, since 1989, we've had 5 elections. And there's been 5 different changes around those periods. So transition to government and taking care of government during caretaker is a really, really important time to be discussing these sort of matters. So the program today is we're going to have a brief presentation from Professor Smith, and then we'll have some questions between he and I and a bit of a discussion, and then we'll be opening it up for you to put your questions online. And we hope you'll get a lot of value out of today as we come to this election year. So we hope you will enjoy as we get on with today. This is a really important and exciting thing to be discussing. And it's very fortunate in our country that we do have these changes of government from time to time, or possible changes to government. And we do have a democratic practice that our governments, when there is an election and a government loses, that they go peacefully and leave the scene for the new government to come in. It's one of the great attributes of the Westminster style system. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Professor Ken Smith to give a bit of an overview in a PowerPoint presentation about taking care during caretaker. And I think you'll get some good advice from someone who's been in the system like you, Gates, what you're confronting in the next few weeks or more.
And could I welcome everyone here to this important session on caretaker periods and what we're involved in. I'll just need to move the slide, which is not moving to me. If I could start by recognising the traditional custodians of the land upon which we're hosting the seminar today with QUT, the Turrbal and the Yagara people and their elders, past and present, coming in here from Meanjin. We're just getting the technical issues with the slides underway. Okay, thank you. So QUT particularly acknowledges the important role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our own community. I just wanted to start by a confidential quiz, which is on Slido, and we might then move to the first question if people just download this on their phone. And there are 2 questions we'll deal with each in turn. Okay, thank you. That was just a quick exercise. You can see the word picture there, and what is turning out to be much more negative perception of politics and the political system in the community. So if we move now to the second question, which is really, the second question relates to you as a public servant. And again, emphasise this is confidential. So please give us your response on how you describe as a public servant politics and the political system, just in one word. Okay, look, I might just finish that there. I often do this in a range of my lectures just to get people to have an understanding of how the general community view politics, as well as within the profession itself. Sorry, I'll have to go out of that too. Yep. Go back into sharing. Thank you. Issues with technology. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. There's clearly a bifurcation of how political astuteness is seen within the community generally. Typically, it's defined negatively, as per the Slido. It's crafty, it's cunning, sly, wily, self-interested. Some of these terms were actually used in your analysis. Also, it can be seen in either positively or in relatively benign terms. That is, it's clever, shrewd, sagacious, critically discerning, perspicacious. That is, there's wisdom, there's issues that underpin decision making in our political systems that are really important. And the Oxford Dictionary defines politics itself as the activities of getting and using power in public life and being able to influence decisions that affect a country and a society. So really important functions that the political system performs. So in the session, I'd like to, as Scott mentioned, provide a sort of a context, really of the importance of our political astuteness and acumen, then sort of a practical guide to caretaker conventions. If I could say this, the joys of being mogged and why we are subject to machinery of government changes, and how the political and policy systems are impacted by external and internal events. And then, Scott, we hope to have enough time to take your questions online. Obviously, the importance of politics is included in Mark Moore's strategic triangle, which in my experience, unless the three things are aligned, we can't get change. So whilst it's important, as some of the Slido representation had, the authorising environment is about can we. The value base is about should we, that is the policy prescription. Much of what we spend our time on is building the organisational capability to actually deliver on public purpose, but also to do so within the authorising environment, the wishes of the government of the day. So often I'll say, Scott, to people, look, public servants think their job's really hard, and Colbatch, looking at public policy, really says politics is really not only important but crucial to the mobilisation of support from a diverse range of sources. The work of governing is about commanding acceptance from relevant stakeholders for policy policy development and implementation. And as we all know, in the sort of VUCA world that we live in, public admin and public policy extends into much broader areas of social life that are more contestable and ambiguous. And a friend of mine often puts up 2 slides and says, when Kennedy was elected in the US, he wanted to put a person on the moon, and he also wanted to abolish urban poverty. Why could he do the first without the second, even though the first was really technically very difficult? And it is those competing interests. So what I'd say to you, it's really important, and Jean Hartley from Open University in the UK has written some reports, and we can provide this through IPAA, on the importance of political astuteness, and has outlined the key components that people should develop to have political acumen, not to act politically, but to understand the political system and what drives the political system. And it includes the sort of personal skills that are important, the interpersonal skills, the sort of core craft skills of a public servant. Reading people and situations is really important. Getting to the bottom of how people look at situations, building alignment and alliances, and strategic direction and scanning, often about issues associated with looking at history, looking at foresight, and looking in developing a historical perspective and a future perspective at developing one's insight. Christine Shearer, and I'll talk about a Macmillan later on in the presentation, is an ATO senior executive, and she wrote her PhD on constructing the craft of public administration. Her conclusion was the political environment is what differentiates the work of the public service from that of the private sector and the not-for-profit sector. She also interviewed a range of secretaries at a Commonwealth level who said the issue in craft skills, that political astuteness was the most important craft skill for them to have, and that the essence of a relationship between a departmental secretary, a department, and a minister is based on trust. You know, that important glue that is important. But the other issue is, rather than politics being a negative thing, I'd put forward a proposition that small p, as well as big P politics, is all around us. You know, political acumen is a vital skill that we all must have, and we need to understand those skills that underpin that issue. If I could move then on to the caretaker issues, and DPC has published the updated convention guidelines for 2024, which is a really good document. And in fact, there are a range of documents around caretaker at a national level, and that underpin the way, as you said, Scott, our Westminster system operates. They're common sense and factual, but like with our regular day jobs, they require interpretation and judgment, you know, common sense. Quoting from the publication, the Caretaker Conventions are not legally binding, nor hard and fast rules, and their application in individual cases requires judgment and common sense. It's a convention, it's not codified, like a lot of conventions underpinning our system of government. They do really rely on trust. It applies to all public officials, whether elected or appointed. And really, it's a foundational principle for us as an apolitical public servant and public service as part of the Queensland Public Service Act. You know, it's legislated that the public service should act in an apolitical manner. We all know we're in a fixed 4-year term, which provides certainty compared to 3-year unfixed election terms. This year, Saturday the 26th of October, the legislation says that the Legislative Assembly is dissolved 26 days before the election, and caretaker starts on the Tuesday, the 1st of October. So the principle is, when the Legislative Assembly is dissolved, there are then no checks and balances over the executive, and therefore we should go into caretaker. And there are a range of issues that happen until either it's certain the return of the current government or when the incoming government is sworn in. A principle, again, of our system is an orderly transition of government. You know, we believe in democracy. The liberal democracy assumes that orderly transition. So during the time, what is important is the normal services of government have to continue. Kids need to go to school, health services need to operate, police services need to operate. The whole of the government doesn't shut down for that period, and decision making doesn't, because it relies on people delivering those services. Put really simply, it's about not proceeding with significant appointments, not approving or implementing new policy, and finally, not entering into major new contracts or undertakings that would commit on all of those three issues an incoming government. So again, the overall principle is to avoid using state resources in a way which advantages a particular political party. Grants are important, that the consideration of and allocation of government funds should not be made during caretaker. That does not mean that parties can't promise particular issues during their campaign, which I think is an important difference. I mean, policy positions can be put by both parties very clearly, so that the community can then make its decision based on the, if you like, the manifesto of both of the parties. The Premier may continue to be involved in Commonwealth state fora, like the National Cabinet. The important proviso is the Premier would consult with the opposition leader if there could be seen as a decision that binds an incoming government. The same with ministerial fora. There may be educational, health ministerial fora that proceed, often with senior public servants rather than ministers attending, but the caretaker conventions are such that a jurisdiction should not commit an incoming government to a policy position that it hasn't been involved in. Cabinet committees generally don't meet. Also, EXCO doesn't meet. There is some exceptions to that when the Premier and Governor, for example, if there was a disaster during a caretaker period and it was important to institute a disaster declaration, then EXCO could meet for the Governor to approve a disaster declaration. Bills introduced to the Parliament but not passed lapse. The Governor doesn't proclaim acts passed by Parliament during caretaker, and in limited situations, regulations may be approved, given that they've been through the House. They haven't been opposed by exception, and the regulations may be required for good government. So therefore, regulations can go through. Just wanted to finish by talking about some sticky issues. Firstly, public sector officers have the right of free political association, but they shouldn't participate in partisan political activities in the course of their duties. You know, that's a fundamental common sense issue during a caretaker period. Obviously, people have a right to contest elections, but they must do so independently of their official capacities. And that, again, is really important. You know, if I'm a police officer or a fiery or a teacher and I'm standing for election, I can't stand using my official position as a justification for my election. Government communication and advertising can continue in a narrow set of circumstances. So, for example, campaigns about road safety, emergency services, declarations, etc., are really that those systems of government continue. The test is that they're not decisions aligned to a particular political party. Generally, you steer clear of highlighting the current portfolio minister. Obviously, there's lots of information around now and lots of stuff, on websites, but generally we should be limiting the exposure of existing ministers during that period. You can use government premises with permission, and again, common sense. You can't do that in a way that invades the privacy of consumers. For example, at a school or an early education centre, or within emergency wing of a hospital, you don't go in and allow people to film people, either without their permission, or should you go into areas that are clearly confidential. You need to be vigilant about agency, and I would put here, Scott reminded me in our communication before this, individual social media commentary. In the world we live in, particularly with Twitter, what's called X, Facebook, TikTok, people often feel free to make commentary that could be seen as political commentary. And my advice to people is to steer clear, if you're a public servant, of individually, let alone organisationally, entering into the fray. It's just not worth it. And there are some precedents which confirm that. The guidelines do allow for provision of factual advice. Again, not just service delivery, but factual advice can be provided to the government of the day. There can be discussions between the opposition and chief executives, but the scope of activities need to be really clear. There's no debate about policy issues. It again is the provision of factual information about departments, agencies, their role, and any factual questions that people might have. Cabinet documents, again, this is a convention. They're property of the party that has created those cabinet documents. Access should be subject to consultation with the party owning the documents before they're released. And it is important that if you've got cabinet documentation, and if there is a government change, that is not available to an incoming government without the protocols taking place. Finally, the responsibility to prepare incoming briefs, which we call famously the red and blue books. Again, they involve specific briefings where there are policy positions that are announced by a particular party, but they also can contain general briefing about the portfolio and issues that are current in the portfolio that may be similar across the books. Importantly, the Labor briefings aren't available to the Coalition, and the Coalition briefings aren't available to Labor. So it's a two-way street. I've come to the conclusion, I know many of you have been on the other end of machinery of government changes. They are very complex from being involved in them over a long period of time. The allocation of portfolio responsibilities across 18 to 19 ministers. What I would say is just get prepared and ready for MOGs. Often a party will have particular predisposition to putting particular functions together, which should be understood and respected. But there is an inevitability of machinery of government, because machinery of government changes highlight the priorities of an administration. So a part of the narrative of that administration. And just to finish, I just wanted to really say to people that it's really important that government policy positions are impacted by events. Going back to Macmillan, and Macmillan was of the publishing family. In that post-war period, he was once asked about the greatest challenge for statesmen, and he said to the journalist, events, dear boy, events. That is, the things you can't control. I love the quote. I mean, it was by Donald Rumsfeld, who in 2002, in relationship to the Iraq War, talked about 4 categories of information: the known knowns, the known unknowns, the unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns. I mean, importantly and seriously, what he's saying is it's a volatile world. You can't necessarily work out what policy position people might have, or governments might have at a particular point in time. And I haven't got time here, but I'd ask people to think about examples of policy positions that have been taken by governments of various political persuasions, and why we should be prepared for the unexpected. I mean, if I go back to New Zealand, Rogernomics in response in the 80s was issues you wouldn't necessarily expect from a Labor national government, but that they were important economic and fiscal reforms, as they were in Australia later on, again, thought about over 10 or 15 years, floating of the Australian dollar, the national competition policy issues, not something you'd normally associate with one side or the other side of politics. In a similar way, Howard's work on gun law reform was really quite interesting after Port Arthur, and quite brave politically, courageous, really. You could say courageous minister, as we will often say. And response to COVID, GFC, you can see, the amazing work that happened, Scott, when you were working with the federal government around COVID, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, the events that caused governments to make decisions that they wouldn't otherwise make to maintain stability within the economy and in the workforce. So I think we could look and talk about many of those issues, but that's where I'll leave it. And Scott, I think go over to you for some questions.
Well, thanks very much, Ken. You've really sort of set the scene for us all and for the audience, explaining what the rules are. And I think it's really interesting. Our system of government works on convention so much. The whole concept of the opposition, they're criticising the government. That's not in the Constitution. If you look at the Australian Constitution, you can't find the opposition, or you can't find even political parties mentioned. And I always like that great phrase we use these days, His Majesty's loyal opposition. That is, the opposition has got to be loyal to the system of government, but can be an opposition and be critical of it. And not many systems have that. We've had that more or less since the 18th century. But I thought it was very interesting, the congruence between your little survey you did of all the participants, between the public survey and the public servant survey. And there was a bit of congruence in some of those comments about trust and those sort of issues, which makes me wondering what's going on inside. But you raised a number of issues about developing trust with a new government or a change of government and the public service. And I understand that at the moment there would be, and whenever there's an election on, possible machinery of government changes, there's always a sense of anxiousness, I think, in the public service about what might happen and what's going to happen to their position and their projects. I know public servants, when I was one, you get attached to projects, and this is my project, and it's going to go somewhere else. But the first question I'd like to ask you is, there seems to be two different views about when there is a change of government. Should a government proceed with all speed, 100 days of action? I get very wary of governments talking about 100 days of action. I would like 100 days of thinking, actually. Or should they proceed cautiously? Now, if you were briefing if there's a change in government, if you're briefing a new Premier or Prime Minister, and given your immense experience, what's your advice about these sort of matters?
Look, I think obviously it's often not one or the other. I think for purposes of this discussion, you can talk about speed of implementation or cautiousness. I think what is important is to set clear and transparent routines. and clearly a book that Glyn Davis was involved in writing was a book called Government of Routines. Processes are important, and good process can be good politics, just as good policy can be good politics. The world that we live in is so complex now that often implementation of simple decisions can have more unintended consequences than intended consequences. I suppose I'm saying, if I look back, I'd be saying to a premier, take your time, define your narrative, define your priorities, and then work with each of those priorities, because usually now there isn't just a simple answer to a particular problem. And I'm very much one to say, let's look at the problem, let's define the problem before we define the solution. Because otherwise what happens is governments and premiers need to backtrack, and we can see that happening at the moment, where decisions are taken very, very quickly outside of the changing views of the community and of stakeholders that need to be taken into account for what might seem to be a very, very simple decision can actually, like the butterfly effect, have impacts more generally. And so without saying, we want to slow you down, just say one of the things that a good public service can do is to assist you with contestable advice. You can make a decision to go in a particular direction, but you should make that decision knowing the full set of circumstances, not just you believe that your gut feel ideology is we have to do this to achieve that. Often there are different ways to achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve. So I would be saying to a premier in particular, trust the public service.
Yes.
It's important to get the public service on side, the least of which, thinking politically, this is a really important constituency. It's up to a quarter or more of the state's workforce, and so therefore you need to take that into account and bring it into your trusted relationships.
Yeah. And you hope the Premier or the Prime Minister would set the example for this, wouldn't you? That this would, I think one of the important things premiers can set the example of how they behave, like Director Generals can, and that the ministers would follow in like kind, and the ministerial staff would follow in like kind in proceeding cautiously. And there's a learning process, isn't there, for new governments and to get across what's going on, isn't there?
Yeah, and often it is really important. I mean, in the wave of riding that wave of success, and people can be very excited about their clear win in election. It's often important to sort of step back, take a deep breath, and ensure that the Premier, who's the first amongst equals in the cabinet, takes their cabinet colleagues along with them. One thing that I had the opportunity to do, and I won't mention the jurisdiction, but when I was at ANZOG, Glyn and Antina and I did some work with one jurisdiction, interviewed every cabinet minister for an hour, talked about priorities, talked about what their narrative would be, and then use that to go back to a cabinet to get an agreement about this is where we're going, this is where we're heading. So I think, you can really be in a situation where you assume that everyone's going in the same direction, but you need to have that discussion amongst the governing group itself to enforce its narrative.
Yeah. Well, good advice. Now, do you think there are particular things a Premier or Minister should be doing to really build that trust? Especially oppositions that have been out of office for some time. And I know an office I joined, the opposition had been out of office, and there was this terrible distrust between the minister's office and the department, which I thought was sort of ridiculous. Of course, the public service was doing the work of the previous government, but that's their job to do the work of the elected government. So what is there something you think they should do to try and break the ice, if you like, when they get into office?
I think one issue, particularly for the establishment of the ministerial offices, is about assisting the Premier and ministers establish their office, because often they find it really hard. They're starting from a cold start. Therefore, I would traditionally offer staff to work with the minister if they, or the Premier, if they wanted that, as they establish their own infrastructure. So beyond departmental liaison officers, potentially senior people to work. I think it's a shame, Scott, that ministerial officers haven't had as many senior public servants sit within them, and having that that seniority of public servants coming into ministerial offices can be really important, in addition to DLOs. So it's not, people wouldn't go into those offices to act politically. They'd be going into those offices to assist with the policy process and the establishment process. So establishment would be one issue. I think the other is to use your personal communication and your core skills to start to develop the trust, develop the understanding, listen, active listening about what the priorities are, what the ways that we can assist either the government perform its functions, because say in premiers there's a range of activities supporting the ministerial services branch, which includes funding and support for the opposition officers, the intersection with Parliament, the intersection with the governor. So there's some factual stuff that needs to underpin that as well, as part of that process, which includes, this is what you need to do. You've just won the election. If there's a change, you've just won the election. You need to, present your credentials to the governor. You need to start thinking about machinery of government. That's a complex process. You need to even, I'll recall one leader that I won't mention, it was they were so elated about winning that they really didn't want to order their ministry. But what is required under statute is you do order your ministry from 1 to 18. One's usually pretty clear. The rest is not. I mean, the deputy position can be clear, but there are just sort of issues like that are required in government to swear in a ministry. And so early on, there's all of the procedural issues and that are quite important, and then setting the frame for the first cabinet meeting, the first discussions are really important.
I think government is very much about process, and I think one of the shocks of incoming government is it's all about process. It's not just all about media releases. There's one more thing. Now you mentioned we're coming up to caretaker period. And yes, we know about the red book and the blue books and so on, which, everyone in the department would be involved in doing that. But in that caretaker period, which is, a month, what sort of advice would you be giving to less senior staff about preparing for, a possible change of government? Are there some tips you would think they should be doing? Should they having more coffee breaks, or what, or should they be doing something else? I know some public servants say, "Whoopee, Scott, we're in caretaker now. You haven't got to annoy us anymore."
Look, I think like any period, the caretaker period doesn't mean that you can't develop thinking, you can't develop your ideas. And one thing very early in my career, I remember a senior public servant who I respected in New South Wales, David Richmond, used to always say, have your ideas, put them, if it's not timely, put them in your bottom drawer, because there may be a time where they're really relevant. So it is, it's not against caretaker to start thinking about, if you're involved in service delivery, service improvement. if you're involved in assessment or an evaluation, how you might go about evaluation. So more than a coffee period, this is an interregnum. It's a time for thinking, for planning, for some work where, if you're not, if you're involved in service delivery, you won't have any space anyway. But if you're involved in programmatic work or work that is defining where we might go to in future, you can start to use that time to think about issues that may come to the fore with a new government. My last slide was really saying, don't presume that you understand everything about a political party and its decision-making arrangements, and that all of the decisions have been made in, party conferences.
Yes, not everything's in the policy document, is it?
No, it can't be. And so therefore governments will be exposed to situations they may not have been exposed to before. Just on, one very practical example, COVID taught us a lot about the need for quick and, literally, on the spot decision making that was required to protect the community.
Because lives are at stake, aren't they?
Yeah. And look, everyone will be associated with that. So, the familiarisation of, in Queensland, disaster management arrangements, whether they be about cyclones or floods or, establishing, the processes. There's plenty of stuff to do, and there's plenty of stuff to think about, rather than a threat, thinking about any change being an opportunity.
Sure.
The final thing I'd say is, often people think that a change of government is more significant. In my experience, a change of minister within a government can actually be more fundamental
that's a really good point.
to an agency than a change of government, because there's a lot of stuff that sort of obviously talks about the difference between the political parties, but there's also there's a heap of stuff that both sides of politics agree to, and they disagree around the edges. One thing I'd say, Scott, is I think what's important is the communication style, and to take a phrase from Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart and the rest is politics, agree to disagree agreeably. So part of the craft skills of the public service is about communication and about doing that in a way that is firm, but
and you would agree,
respectful.
Public servants could say, "Look, I don't think that's quite right." You can say that, and certainly you've done that from time to time. I'm quite sure, and certainly I have from time to time.
Yeah, and in fact, people, I think, Scott, respect you more than being a noddy. That if the people that add value are the people that actually say, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? There are a range of perspectives. This could be the implication of moving down that policy. It's not about blocking. It's about really adding value.
The public service, I see, are the professionals. That's my view about the public service. So let's listen to the professionals. Is my
and it's about evidence, and then where evidence then comes up against the issues. The last thing, and we're being told that time's up, but the last thing that I think is really very important is to understand the demands on politicians' time, ministers' time, that the portfolio is but one demand.
Right.
They are members of cabinet, they are members of parliament, they have a constituency, and so often public servants think their minister is solely there for them. They're pulled in lots of different directions, and as I mentioned before, yes, we'd love evidence just to be used, but we actually know that it's not just an evidentiary base that impacts on decision making. So in looking at any sort of force field analysis on any decision, there are usually factors that influence and help that decision to be put in place, and there are often factors that oppose it. And the art of politics is often to mediate between those, and it might be imperfect, but as Churchill said, it's the best of all of the systems we've thought about, to date.
Well, I think there's some really good tips and really good advice from Ken, who's been through lots of different changes and processes in the process. We now have some questions coming up, which I can't read any of those questions. Okay, so.
We have one question. In your experience, are there some common pitfalls that can get the relationship between the department and the new MO off to a bad start? Things to avoid and tips that can get things off to a great start.
Look, I think relating on understanding what position they're in, also understanding that different ministers have different styles. So one important thing to do is to think from a demand perspective rather than think from a supply perspective. So you've got to actually put yourselves in their shoes. They may not be a lawyer, which is unusual, I know. They may be from a trade background. They're new to this area. Treat people with due respect and dignity, and get an understanding of how they prefer to do things. I mean, probably not so much at a federal level, but at a state level, some people are very visual. They want visual prompts. They want to talk through issues. Other people want to go through stuff in great wads of detail in writing.
That's right.
And so it's really getting that early.
Sort of understanding the style of the minister.
Understanding the style of the minister, and the style of the minister in a ministry of 18 people, there'll be 18 different styles.
Right. Yeah.
And people find this with a change of minister. One minister can be 50 questions and read, a cabinet submission from end to end and have questions on Appendix X. Others will say, talk me through this. And rely on far less information. So it's just, it's really coming from that supply perspective, which I think is the biggest hint that I'd give.
Yeah. Good points. Thanks, Ken.
People couldn't hear that last question. If you could just tell them that was about how they get off to a great start.
Okay, sorry we're just having some technical difficulties. It was about how people can get off to a great start in the relationship. So you got the answer before you got the questions.
The next question we have, you'll have to read it again, is do you have any tips on how to continue policy stewardship for a change of government?
Yeah, the next question is about policy stewardship for a change of government. Again, if I was going through this in more detail, I'd actually say the policy environment is more likely, because of the changing world that we live in and the rapidity of change, to provide opportunities that are not, if you like, traditionally ideologically based. And so there is really good opportunity, going back to Scott's point, that the public service should be presenting themselves as experts independently in those areas, but that expertise needs to be impacted by opinions, whether they be factually based or not, within the community. So, to give you one concrete example, if someone came from a point of view that they're an anti-vaxxer, my view is understanding what are the drivers behind being an anti-vaxxer, rather than judging, as a lot of us would normally from an evidence-based perspective. Another example I'd give is during the droughts in Queensland, both the Commonwealth Government through Malcolm Turnbull, who was the water minister at the time, and the state government put a heap of billions of dollars into water recycling plants. the community clearly felt uncomfortable, despite the evidence that this produced pure water that minerals needed to be added to, purer water than comes out of Wivenhoe. The evidence was really clear. It wasn't about judging that people didn't want to put the recycled water back into the dam, and if they did, they wanted to do it when the dam was almost empty rather than the dam was almost full, which didn't make particular sense to me. But having said that, you've just got to really get an understanding that these are the factors that weigh on political decisions sometimes, which are not necessarily evidence-based and not necessarily, everything in politics. Scott, you might disagree, but it's not all logical.
No,
and
I agree.
you really come from that point that this is about what's happening in the community, what stakeholders are saying, and people are buffeted by those arrangements. And the art of politics is actually to find your way through that to a solution, but which may not be necessarily the best solution, but is the best solution at the time.
And that's all you can really achieve. I think we've got time for another question.
Sure. There's one on fixed election terms and whether you think that has been better for the public service.
I've got a view on that too.
Yeah. Well, Scott might have a view on it. Yeah, look, with fixed election terms, I think it has been really important to have certainty. Scott might disagree, but I think the problem with a 3-year non-fixed is that the average term can be less than 3 years, and so you have greater turnover. It clearly, there are various views on that, but the Queensland people, like the rest of the country, have decided at local government and at state and territory government level, 4-year terms are appropriate. There's clearly some issues at a national level which are more complicated because of the relationship of the House and Senate. But look, I think they've provided some greater certainty.
Right. Well, we don't have that at the national level, as everyone knows. You've got to change the constitution, and I can't see any government going for a referendum on that issue. It's been knocked back a couple of times. I'm in the camp, by the way, that I don't like giving politicians any extra time in office. So shorter rather than longer is my view.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it'd be interesting to take up, because I lived in the UK where the terms were 5 years.
But,
but they didn't always run. They weren't 5-year fixed. I'm still of the view that can be changed and that people can vote governments out. They lose confidence, but it's it'd be a great topic.
Happy to have a debate about that sometime.
Yeah.
So I think we're coming to the end of this Mastercraft class, and we hope you've really got something out of today, and also follow up some of the information that's been provided. I think we're going to provide you some other articles and things afterwards, which you can read. And there's the Australian Journal of Public Administration I give a plug for, which this association is connected to, which has lots of great articles on all sorts of things. And there are some articles on transitions to government and caretaker. And it's again, just to say to everyone, it's fantastic in our society that we have a caretaker period. There's an election happen over in South America recently, or near South America, where the government lost the election but won't leave. Now that's really a problem. So we know that doesn't happen in Australia, and we know we do it in a cordial fashion. And I'm always fascinated when some prime ministers lose and they invite the new prime minister to show him around the office. And I think that's pretty good. That's the way it should be. So thanks very much, everyone. And thanks again, Ken, for a great talk.
Thank you, Scott.